The air in the private dining room of La Centilla was not merely air. It was a curated atmosphere, a heavy, gilded substance that smelled of old money, leather, and the earthy perfume of black truffles shaved over handmade pasta. It was a sanctuary built for men who moved markets and ended careers between sips of Barolo that cost more than a month's rent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the coffered ceiling like frozen constellations, their lights splintering across the dark mahogany walls and catching the silver gleam of cutlery laid with geometric precision. The silence was profound, broken only by the hushed clinking of that silver against porcelain, and the low murmur of conversations that could alter the city's skyline. Moving through this opulent theater was Elena Rossi, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. Her movements were a study in professional invisibility, a fluid, silent dance of refilling water glasses and clearing plates, her presence acknowledged only by its absence. She was part of the room's perfect machinery, as functional and unnoticed as the velvet curtains that absorbed both sound and secrets. To the men she served, Elena was nothing more than a pair of hands, a silent automaton programmed for service. But beneath the starched collar and the placid, carefully neutral expression, a universe of intellect and memory churned. Inside her lived a former linguistics prodigy from Columbia University, a scholar who once found more beauty in the syntax of a dying dialect than in any diamond. She could trace the etymological roots of a word back through centuries, hearing the echoes of history in a single syllable. Her academic career, once a blazing comet, had been extinguished, forced into a holding pattern by the crushing gravity of familial duty. Now, instead of dusty archives and lecture halls, her world was this 10 by 10 meter room, a gilded cage where she traded her brilliance for survival, each perfectly poured glass of water, a small, bitter sacrifice on the altar of her father's well-being. The contrast was a constant, dull ache behind her ribs, the world-class mind cataloging the grammatical decay of their slurred Italian, while her hands cleared away their half-eaten bread. Her motivation was a singular, unwavering flame burning in the quiet darkness of her life, her father. She could still conjure the image of him in his prime, a man whose strength seemed as boundless as his kindness, his arms perpetually dusted with a fine layer of flour from the bakery that was his life's work. The scent of warm, crusty bread had been the backdrop of her childhood, a smell of safety and love. That world had crumbled to ash. She remembered the day the life drained from his eyes, the result of a debilitating stroke brought on by the relentless pressure and violent threats of a local crime syndicate. They had bled his business dry, their casual cruelty shattering his spirit long before his body gave way. Now he was a shadow of the man he once was, confined to a bed in a sterile care facility. His world shrunk to the 4 white walls of his room. Every shift Elena worked, every condescending glance she endured, was for him. It was to pay for the nurses, for the quiet dignity of a private room, for the small comfort of knowing he was not alone while she toiled away in this palace of excess. The most precious thing her father had ever given her was not something that could be taken away. It was a language, a secret key to a lost world. He had taught her the specific, antiquated dialect of his small Sicilian village near Corleone, a variant so old and localized that even modern Sicilian speakers would find it a foreign tongue. It was not a language learned from books, but one absorbed at his knee, woven into lullabies, proverbs, and bedtime stories. It was the language of their private jokes, their whispered secrets, a sacred space where only they could enter. It was a language of ghosts, full of metaphor and layered meaning, where a single phrase could carry the weight of a generation's worth of history. She held it inside her now, a dormant power, a piece of her father's soul that no one in this room or this city could ever imagine she possessed. It was a treasure she guarded fiercely, a connection to the man he used to be, a living artifact of a life that had been stolen from them. The delicate equilibrium of the room shattered with the arrival of Don Marco Valerio. He did not simply enter, he conquered the space. The air itself seemed to grow colder, thinner, condensing around his formidable presence. He was a man sculpted from ice and ambition, his custom-tailored suit, a dark armor over a heart that beat with the cold rhythm of a predator. His lieutenants flanked him, their own considerable power diminished to mere satellites orbiting his dark star. The restaurant's owner, a man who commanded respect from politicians and celebrities, scurried to his side, his posture one of near-total submission. Valerio moved with an economy of motion that bespoke absolute confidence, his eyes sweeping the room not with interest, but with the casual disdain of an emperor surveying a territory he already owned. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her gut, a cold dread she recognized as the presence of a man who saw other human beings not as people but as instruments or obstacles. He took his seat at the head of the table, a king ascending his throne, and waved a hand dismissively, a silent command for the service to begin and the invisible to remain invisible. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. Don Valerio settled into his chair, his demeanor radiating a chilling boredom, as if the immense power he wielded was more of a burden than a privilege. He was here to hold court, to address a matter of annoyance that had disturbed the smooth operation of his empire. A rival, a man named Silvio Gallo, had been making foolish moves, and Valerio had decided it was time to demonstrate the extent of Gallo's incompetence to his inner circle. He produced a small, sophisticated digital recorder and placed it on the center of the mahogany table. The device looked alien amidst the old-world finery, a cold piece of modern technology in a room that felt preserved in amber. The air grew thick with anticipation as his men leaned forward, their faces a mixture of curiosity and predatory eagerness. With a flick of his thumb, Valerio pressed play. The recorder emitted a low hiss of static, followed by a man's voice, rough and guttural, speaking in a rapid-fire cadence that filled the room with a cascade of unfamiliar sounds. It was Italian, but not the smooth, melodic language of Florence or the clipped, business-like dialect of Milan. This was something older, something pulled from the rocky soil of Sicily itself. Valerio's men, all of whom spoke modern Sicilian, strained to understand. They exchanged confused glances, catching a word here and there but failing to grasp the meaning, like men trying to catch smoke in their fists. One of them, a burly capo named Leo, offered a translation, suggesting it was about a shipment of goods. Valerio let out a soft, contemptuous chuckle, the sound like ice cracking. He looked at his men with a profound sense of disappointment, his gaze sweeping over them as if they were a collection of flawed tools. He was surrounded by hammers, when what he needed was a scalpel. During this display, Elena moved with the silent grace of a shadow, her presence entirely erased from their consciousness. She circled the table, the heavy crystal pitcher in her hand cool against her skin, refilling their glasses with water. To Valerio, she was less than a ghost. She was an object, a function, a part of the room's ambient service. The utter completeness of his dismissal was a unique form of humiliation. He discussed matters of betrayal and violence as if she were not there, as if she were deaf and dumb, a creature without thought or feeling. But as the scratchy recording played on, the ancient dialect seeped into her ears not as noise, but as music. It was the sound of her father's voice telling her stories of the old country. Each strange, forgotten word was a key, unlocking a door to her past. And as Valerio's dismissive gaze swept past her, not even registering her existence, a cold fury began to solidify in her veins. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of passion, but something far more dangerous, a glacial resolve, a hardening of her soul. Her hands, pouring the water, remained perfectly steady, but inside her, a storm was gathering, connecting this man's arrogance to the very same prideful cruelty that had broken her father. The charade of translation continued, growing more pathetic with each attempt. Finally, a younger lieutenant, eager to impress, offered a confident but wildly incorrect interpretation, claiming the message was a convoluted apology from the rival. Don Valerio sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated disgust. He was about to turn off the recorder, to dismiss his men as the simpletons he believed them to be. But in that moment, the delicate rhythm of the room was broken by the smallest of actions. Elena, who was standing beside the lieutenant, paused. The crystal pitcher in her hand, poised to pour, froze in midair. The silence that followed was absolute, a sudden, jarring void in the fabric of the evening. Every eye in the room, which had ignored her for hours, now snapped to her still form. She had not made a sound, but her stillness was a shout in the quiet room. For a heartbeat, she remained a statue. The weight of her choice, the choice to remain invisible or to step into the light, pressing down on her with the force of her entire life. The water in the pitcher was perfectly clear, yet in it she could see the reflection of two possible futures. Slowly, deliberately, Elena lowered the crystal pitcher until its base rested on the dark, polished wood of a nearby serving trolley. The motion was so smooth, so silent, it was almost imperceptible, yet it carried the finality of a gavel striking down a verdict. She did not look up. Her gaze remained fixed on the intricate weave of the damask tablecloth, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting forces. To speak was to shatter the shield of invisibility that had protected her for years, to invite a kind of attention she had meticulously avoided. To remain silent, however, felt like a betrayal of a different kind, a betrayal of her father, of the language he had gifted her, and of the quiet, burning ember of justice she kept hidden in her soul. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the unspoken question hanging between them all. The low murmur of the city outside seemed to fade into nothingness, leaving only the sound of her own heart, a steady, powerful drumbeat against the cage of her ribs, counting down the seconds to a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. The world had shrunk to this single moment, this precipice between the past she endured and a future she could not yet imagine. Don Marco Valerio leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his lips. The girl's stillness amused him. It was an unexpected glitch in the otherwise flawless machinery of his evening. He saw her not as a person, but as a curiosity, a minor diversion. His world was populated by men who postured and plotted, their ambitions and fears as predictable as the tides. This silent waitress, this piece of living furniture, had momentarily broken the script, and for that, he felt a flicker of cruel entertainment. He lifted a perfectly manicured hand, a gesture that both commanded attention and dismissed the gravity of the situation. He addressed her not directly, but as one might address a child who had spoken out of turn, his voice laced with a condescending sweetness that was far more menacing than any shout. He wanted to draw out the moment, to savor the absurdity of it all before restoring the natural order. He looked around at his men, sharing a silent joke at her expense, his eyes gleaming with the certainty of a man who had never once in his adult life been challenged by someone he considered an inferior. Elena felt his gaze upon her, a physical weight that sought to press her down, to remind her of her place, but instead of shrinking she drew strength from it. In her mind's eye, an image bloomed with painful clarity. Her father, sitting by the window of his room at the care facility, his gaze distant, his once powerful hands, now frail and spotted, resting limply in his lap. The memory was not a source of sadness in this moment, but a crucible. The humiliation Valerio projected onto her was a pale shadow of the injustice that had been inflicted upon her family. The casual cruelty in his voice was the same tone she imagined he had used when he and his thugs had bled her father's business dry, their threats whispered with the same dismissive arrogance. A lifetime of swallowed pride, of silent endurance, coalesced into a single point of unyielding resolve. The fury that had been a cold, slow-moving glacier in her veins now hardened into something akin to diamond. She finally lifted her head, and the eyes that met Valerio's were not those of a frightened servant. They were the eyes of a scholar, clear, focused, and utterly devoid of fear. The transformation was seismic, though it was marked by no grand gesture. Her shoulders, once slightly rounded in a posture of deference, squared. Her spine straightened, adding an inch to her height. She was no longer a ghost inhabiting a uniform. She was a presence, a force that commanded the space she occupied. When she spoke, her voice was nothing like the hushed, professional tone she used to ask if a glass needed refilling. It was a voice that had once commanded lecture halls, a voice of academic precision and unshakable confidence. It was calm, measured, and carried a resonance that cut through the thick, cigar-scented air of the room with the sharpness of cut glass. She did not raise her voice, for she did not need to. The authority in her tone was absolute, drawing every ounce of attention and energy in the room toward her. The men at the table, who had looked through her for hours, now found themselves unable to look away, their expressions shifting from confusion to a dawning, uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something far outside the bounds of their experience. She began, her gaze locked on Valerio, creating an unbreakable conduit of challenge between them. She did not consult a memory. She simply opened a channel to a part of her soul that had lain dormant for years. The words of the ancient dialect flowed from her as if she were reading from a script written on the air itself. She started with the opening phrases, the ones Valerio's men had so laughably misinterpreted as a clumsy apology. She explained the layered meanings, the historical context of the proverbs used, showing how the rival, Silvio Gallo, was not apologizing, but was, in fact, mocking Valerio's perceived weakness, using an old Sicilian parable about a lion who had grown too old to hunt. She deconstructed the grammar, the syntax, the very rhythm of the speech, laying bare the intricate web of insults that Gallo had woven into his message, each one a carefully crafted barb designed to question Valerio's honor and his grip on power. The room was utterly still, the only sound her clear, unwavering voice, translating not just words, but the culture and the blood-soaked history from which they sprang. Then she moved to the core of the message, the part that turned insults into a declaration of war. She methodically unraveled the coded language, her delivery as precise and dispassionate as a surgeon making an incision. The phrase his men had mistaken for a shipment of goods, she explained, was a well-known Corleonese euphemism. She detailed its origins. From the Sicilian Vespers of the 13th century, a phrase used to signal the beginning of a rebellion. It was not about a shipment. It was about the delivery of a team of assassins, men brought in from the mainland, professionals who had no local ties and no allegiance to any of the city's families. She described how the dialect used specific, archaic terms for weaponry, terms that even a fluent modern speaker would never recognize, painting a picture of a well-armed, well-prepared force ready to strike at a moment's notice. A bead of sweat trickled down the temple of one of Valerio's lieutenants, his face pale under the golden light of the chandelier. She paused for a beat, letting the weight of her words settle into the suffocating silence of the room. The men around the table were no longer looking at Valerio for their cues. Their eyes were fixed on her, their faces a mask of disbelief and a growing primal fear. She continued, her voice dropping slightly, drawing them in further as she revealed the next layer of the plot. The mention of a specific saint's day, which had been dismissed as irrelevant chatter, was in fact the timeline. She explained that the feast day of Saint Rosalia was that very evening, a traditional time for settling old scores in Gallo's ancestral village. The message was not a plan for the future. It was a timetable for the immediate present. The attack was not days or weeks away. It was scheduled for that night, in a matter of hours, a fact that sent a visible ripple of shock through the assembled men, their cigars forgotten in the ashtrays, their expensive wine untouched in their glasses. The opulence of the room suddenly felt like a trap, its gilded walls closing in on them. Finally, she delivered the killing blow, the part of the message that would shatter the trust within the room and turn Valerio's fortress into a viper's nest. She translated the final, cryptic line of the recording, a line that had been completely ignored by Valerio's men. It was a proverb about a shepherd who trusts a wolf to guard his flock. She looked away from Valerio for the first time, her gaze slowly, deliberately sweeping across the faces of the lieutenants seated at the table. She explained that the proverb was always followed by a name, a signifier of the traitor. The recording named the wolf. Her eyes came to rest on Leo, the burly capo who had offered the first, confident, and utterly wrong translation. She recited the line from the recording, the ancient words clear and damning in the silent room. She then translated it into plain, brutal English. "The payment has been delivered to the one who sits at your right hand." Leo's face, which had been a mask of smug confidence moments before, crumpled into a canvas of pure, unadulterated terror. The silence that followed was a physical entity, a crushing pressure that seemed to suck the very air from the room. It was broken by a single, sharp sound, the heavy silver fork of the man next to Leo, clattering from his nerveless fingers onto his porcelain plate. The noise was like a gunshot, shattering the spell. Don Marco Valerio's face was a study in controlled chaos. The amusement had vanished, replaced by a glacial disbelief that was rapidly hardening into a cold, terrifying fury. His eyes, the color of chips of ice, narrowed to slits, fixed on Elena. He saw her now, not as a piece of furniture, but as an oracle, a ghost who had risen from the background to speak a truth so devastating it threatened to bring his entire world crashing down around him. He did not look at Leo. His focus was entirely on the impossible woman standing before him, the source of this catastrophic revelation. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Leo, the accused traitor, made a fatal mistake. A single, reflexive twitch of his hand toward the inside of his jacket was all the confirmation Valerio needed. Before he could move another inch, two of the other lieutenants, their loyalty proven by their swiftness, had risen from their chairs. One pinned Leo's arms behind his back while the other relieved him of the small, pearl-handled pistol nestled in his shoulder holster. The movements were economical, brutal, and silent. Leo did not struggle. He simply sagged in their grip, his face ashen, his eyes wide with the knowledge of his fate. He looked at Valerio, a silent plea for a mercy he knew would not be granted. Valerio ignored him completely. His entire being was focused on Elena, his mind racing to process the implications of what had just happened. He had been saved from assassination not by his highly paid, heavily armed inner circle, but by an invisible waitress who should not exist. Valerio rose from his chair, his movement slow and deliberate, like a great predator uncoiling. The fury in his eyes was now contained, banked like the embers of a fire that could incinerate everything around him. He walked around the table, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. He stopped directly in front of Elena, so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a stark contrast to the stench of fear that now permeated the room. He did not speak. He simply studied her, his gaze intense, analytical, searching for an answer to the impossible question she presented. Who was she? Where did she come from? How did she possess a key to a lock he hadn't even known existed? He was a man who controlled every variable, who left nothing to chance, and her presence was a wild, unaccountable element that threatened the very foundations of his understanding of the world. Then he spoke, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that was meant for her alone, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. "Lock the doors." The command was soft, but it held the unyielding force of an iron fist. The owner of the restaurant, who had been hovering near the entrance, frozen in a state of terrified paralysis, flinched as if struck. One of Valerio's men moved to the heavy mahogany doors and slid the ornate brass bolt into place. The sound echoed in the room, a definitive, metallic click that sealed them all inside. The private dining room of La Sentia was no longer a restaurant. It had become a cage, an interrogation chamber. Elena felt a tremor of fear, the first true tendril of panic, but she forced it down, burying it deep beneath the cold resolve that had become her armor. She knew that her life now depended on the same intellect that had just saved Valerio's. The restaurant owner, a man named Signore Bonomi, found a sliver of courage. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands clasped in front of him, his face a mess of professional concern and personal terror. He began to stammer, speaking of the restaurant's reputation, of the other guests, trying to appeal to a sense of decorum that no longer existed in this room. Valerio did not even grant him a glance. He simply raised his left hand, a gesture of finality, and the owner's words died in his throat. Bonomi retreated, melting back into the shadows by the wall, his authority in his own establishment utterly and completely negated. He was now just another prisoner, a witness to a drama he could not control. The message was clear. The normal rules of the world had been suspended within these four walls. The only law that mattered now was the will of Don Marco Valerio. Valerio began to circle her, his steps measured, his eyes never leaving her face. The predator was assessing its prey, or perhaps a new, strange creature it did not understand. He tilted his head, a gesture of feigned curiosity that did little to mask the menace beneath. He asked the question again, his voice still a whisper, but now laced with a thread of steel. He wanted to know everything. He demanded to know where she learned what he called the language of ghosts. He asked who she worked for, assuming she must be a plant, a spy sent by a rival, perhaps even by Gallo himself. The idea that she could be exactly what she appeared to be, a simple waitress, was too absurd for his mind to comprehend. In his world, knowledge like hers was a weapon, and weapons were always wielded by powerful hands. He could not conceive that such a weapon could be found in the possession of someone he considered to be nothing. Elena kept her breathing even, her heart a steady drum against her ribs. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a hyper-focused clarity. She understood that she was walking a razor's edge. One wrong word, one flicker of defiance, could be her end. But she also understood that her knowledge was, for the moment, her shield. She was valuable to him. As long as she was the only one who could unlock these secrets, she was, in a strange and terrifying way, safe. She gave him a piece of the truth, a carefully curated version that would satisfy his questions without revealing the core of who she was. She told him about her studies at the university, about her specialization in linguistics, framing it as a forgotten academic pursuit, a hobby that had unexpectedly become relevant. She painted herself as a scholar, a civilian caught by accident in a world she did not understand, hoping the image of the harmless academic would be more believable than any other explanation. Valerio listened, his expression unreadable. He did not seem to believe her, but he did not dismiss her story either. He was processing, calculating, his mind working through the angles. To intimidate her, to break through what he perceived as a well-rehearsed lie, he began to boast. He spoke of his own power, of the length of his memory for traitors, and the breadth of his reach. He talked about the city as if it were his personal chessboard, and all the people in it merely pawns for him to move or sacrifice as he saw fit. He wanted to frighten her into submission, to make her understand the futility of any deception. He described how he had built his empire, not just through inheritance, but by crushing the small and the weak, by clearing away the debris of outdated businesses and sentimental old men who stood in the way of his progress. He spoke of it with a chilling lack of emotion, as if he were describing a simple business transaction. And then he said the words. The phrase was almost a throwaway line, a piece of casual, cruel philosophy he had likely used 100 times before. He was talking about the weak men he had displaced, the small business owners who couldn't adapt to his new, more brutal way of doing things. He gestured dismissively with his hand, a small, contemptuous flick of the wrist. He said that some men were built for the new world, for the hard realities of business, and others, well, others were just flour waiting to be swept away. The metaphor was so specific, so unusual, that it struck Elena with the force of a physical blow. The gilded room around her seemed to dissolve, the faces of the terrified men fading into a blur. The scent of truffles and old leather was replaced by the warm, yeasty smell of baking bread, the smell of her childhood, the smell of home. Time collapsed. She was no longer in a high-end restaurant, but standing in the doorway of her father's bakery, a small, sunny shop filled with the love and labor of a lifetime. She was a teenager again, watching as a younger but no less menacing Marco Valerio stood before her father. She saw the scene as if it were happening right now, the way Valerio's expensive suit looked so out of place amongst the sacks of flour, the cruel smirk on his face as he delivered his final threat. She heard his voice, the same cold, dismissive tone, uttering the exact same words. Some men are built for business, others are just flour waiting to be swept away. She watched again as the light in her father's eyes extinguished, as his spirit, the very core of his being, broke under the weight of that casual, soul-crushing cruelty. The memory, which had been a source of grief for so long, now ignited with a new, terrible energy. The connection slammed into her, a revelation so profound it stole the air from her lungs. This was not a random encounter, this was not an accident of fate. The man standing before her, the man whose life she had just saved, was the architect of her family's ruin. He was the faceless monster from her past, the direct cause of her father's stroke, the reason her academic dreams had turned to ash, the reason she was serving men like him in this gilded cage. The universe, in an act of supreme and terrible irony, had placed her tormentor directly in her path and made him dependent on the very skills he had forced her to abandon. The cold fury that had been her shield now morphed into something else entirely, something hotter and far more dangerous. It was the fire of vengeance, a righteous, burning rage that consumed every last trace of her fear. Her mission, in that instant, shifted from simple survival to a singular, all-consuming purpose: justice. On the outside, her transformation was nearly imperceptible. Perhaps there was a subtle hardening in her eyes, a new stillness in her posture that was no longer about fear, but about a profound and chilling focus. Valerio, blinded by his own arrogance, saw only what he wanted to see. He interpreted her silence as shock, her stillness as the fear of a woman who was finally beginning to comprehend the danger she was in. He believed his intimidation tactics were working, that he was breaking her down, peeling away her lies to get to the truth. He could not have been more wrong. He was not looking at a terrified waitress. He was looking at his judge, his jury, and, if she had her way, his executioner. His greatest mistake, the one he had built his entire empire upon, was his inability to see the humanity, the history, and the potential for retribution in those he deemed beneath him. A new strategy began to form in her mind, a plan born of grief and fury, sharpened by a world-class intellect. She could not fight him with force, she had none. She could not fight him with money or influence, she was invisible. But she could fight him with her mind, she could fight him with the language her father had given her. She would play the part he had cast for her, the terrified but useful asset. She would become his tool, his translator, his key to navigating the treacherous waters of his own world. She would make herself indispensable to him, embedding herself so deeply in his operations that he would come to rely on her. She would use the very weapon he sought to control to orchestrate his downfall. It was a dangerous, almost suicidal path, but it was the only one that led to the justice her father deserved. She let out a small, shaky breath, a perfectly calibrated performance of fear. She looked up at him, widening her eyes just enough to seem overwhelmed and pliable. She nodded slowly, as if his words had finally broken her spirit. She told him she understood. She told him she would help. She offered her services, her unique skill, not as a bargain but as a plea for her own safety. She played the role of the frightened civilian who just wanted to go home, who would do anything he asked to escape this nightmare. She needed him to believe in her weakness, to trust in his own power over her. His arrogance, the very thing that had destroyed her family, would now become her greatest weapon. It would be the blindfold that would prevent him from seeing the trap she was about to build around him, piece by painstaking piece. Valerio watched her, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He had broken her, or so he thought. He saw a useful instrument, a ghost who could speak, as he had thought of her earlier. He began to lay out his immediate problem. He needed to respond to Gallo's message. He needed to set a trap, to turn this assassination plot back on his rival. He needed her to craft a reply in the same ancient dialect, a message that would lure Gallo to a location of his choosing, a place where he, Valerio, would have the upper hand. He was so focused on the immediate threat from his rival that he never once considered the far greater threat standing 2 feet in front of him, agreeing meekly to his every command. He was playing checkers while Elena, in the silent, calculating depths of her mind, was beginning a game of chess. As he spoke, detailing his plans for a counter-ambush, Elena's mind was a whirlwind of activity. She listened to every word, absorbing the tactical details, but she was simultaneously constructing her own, far more elaborate strategy. Her plan would require an outside element, a force more powerful than either of these crime families. She needed to contact the authorities, but she couldn't do it directly. She needed someone who would understand a coded message, someone who would believe her, someone who had the connections to act on the information she could provide. An image of her old mentor from Columbia University, Dr. Albright, flashed in her mind. He was a brilliant, kind man who had been deeply disappointed when she had dropped out of the program. He had always respected her talent, and she knew he had gone on to do consulting work for various federal agencies, including the FBI. He was her only hope. She knew she would be allowed no privacy, no unmonitored contact with the outside world. Valerio was paranoid, and his paranoia was now her biggest obstacle. She had to devise a pretext for a phone call, a reason so mundane, so believable that he would grant it. The perfect excuse was the very motivation that had driven her for years: her father. She would ask to call the care facility just to check on him, to make sure he was all right. It was the request of a dutiful, frightened daughter, a role she could play with perfect authenticity because, at its core, it was the truth. It was a vulnerability she could display that would mask her true, deadly intention. The thought of using her father's plight in this way felt like a small sacrilege, but she knew he would have understood. This was for him. With her heart pounding, she waited for a pause in Valerio's monologue. When it came, she made her request, her voice carefully modulated to sound small and timid. She explained that her father was very ill, that she was his only family, and that she was required to check in with his nurses every night. She looked down at the floor, a picture of filial devotion and fear. She was counting on his disdain, on his belief that such sentimental attachments were a weakness of the lower classes, a triviality that he could grant without consequence. She needed him to see her as a simple girl worried about her sick father, not as a strategic genius laying the first stone of his tomb. She held her breath, the entire future of her plan resting on his response to this one, simple, human request. Valerio stared at her for a long moment, his mind weighing the variables. His paranoia screamed at him that any contact with the outside world was a risk, but his arrogance whispered that she was a broken, terrified girl, and this was a request born of weakness, not cunning. Allowing the call would reinforce his control over her, a small act of magnanimity from an all-powerful ruler. It was a risk, but a negligible one. He finally gave a short, sharp nod. He would allow it. One call, on speakerphone, with him and his men listening to every word. The conditions were strict, but it was the opening she needed. It was the crack in the fortress wall through which she would lead an army. The small victories sent a surge of adrenaline through her, a dangerous, exhilarating current of hope. The decision was made. The next phase of her life had begun. She was no longer Elena Rossi, the invisible waitress. She was an agent of justice, operating deep behind enemy lines. She was a prisoner in a room that smelled of fear and expensive cologne, surrounded by men who would kill her without a second thought if they knew the truth. But for the first time since her father's world had collapsed, she felt a sense of power. It was a terrifying, precarious power, one that depended entirely on her ability to outwit a man who believed himself to be invincible. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. The phone felt alien in her hand, a cold, smooth piece of plastic that was both her lifeline and a potential instrument of her own execution. Don Marco Valerio stood just a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. His lieutenants formed a loose, menacing circle around her, their eyes like the lenses of cameras, recording her every flicker of movement, every subtle intonation. The air was thick, with the lingering scent of expensive wine and the sharp, acrid smell of paranoia. The speakerphone button was activated, its small green light a malevolent eye staring up at her from the center of the mahogany table. She knew that every word, every pause, every shaky breath would be dissected, analyzed for any hint of deception. In her mind, she ran through the script she had created, a desperate, intricate piece of theater where one wrong word would bring the final curtain down on her life. She had to weave a message of hope into a conversation of despair, a call for war into a gentle inquiry about a sick man's health. The weight of this task was immense, a physical pressure in her chest that made it difficult to draw a full breath, but the image of her father's tired face was a burning coal in her heart, providing a painful, clarifying heat. She dialed the number from memory, the 10 digits of familiar sequence that connected her to the quiet, sterile world of the St. Jude's Care Facility. Each beep of the keypad seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the room, a countdown to the most dangerous performance of her life. The phone rang once, twice, and then a calm, professional voice answered. "St. Jude's, night nursing station. This is Maria speaking." Elena's own voice, when she spoke, was a carefully crafted instrument of worried fragility. She introduced herself, the dutiful daughter, her tone hushed and respectful, a perfect mirror of the thousands of similar calls she had made over the past few years. She asked about her father, using his full name, Giuseppe Rossi, a name that felt heavy and sacred on her tongue in this den of thieves. As the nurse gave a routine update, his vitals were stable, he had eaten a little, he was resting. Elena's mind was racing, preparing to embed her true message into the mundane details of a patient's daily life. She had to trust that Dr. Albright, a man who lived and breathed patterns and linguistic anomalies, would see the signal flare she was about to launch into the darkness. The moment came. After thanking the nurse, Elena paused, feigning a moment of emotional recollection. She asked the nurse to pass a message to her father, knowing he was likely asleep and would never hear it. This was the part of the message intended for the ears of her old professor. She began by referencing a specific academic paper they had co-authored years ago, a study on the linguistic drift of post-war Sicilian dialects, framing it as a memory, a story her father used to love. She mentioned Thesis 7B, a code they had once joked about, which referred to a section on military codes hidden within agricultural terminology. She then spoke of her father's favorite proverb, deliberately misquoting it in a way that only a trained linguist would recognize as a structural flag. She said, "Tell him the old Corleone saying is true. The vulture who waits for the storm finds only scattered sheep." It was a subtle but profound alteration. The real proverb was about a patient hawk, not a vulture, and it was about finding a feast, not scattered sheep. The word vulture was a direct reference to Valerio's moniker, and scattered sheep was a clear signal of disorganized, vulnerable targets. She continued, weaving more threads into her coded tapestry. She asked the nurse to remind her father of the old bakery address, giving the number 187, a not-so-subtle nod to the penal code for murder. She then mentioned a specific delivery of flour that was scheduled for tomorrow night at 10 o'clock, using the same flour metaphor that Valerio had so carelessly thrown at her, turning his own cruel words into a weapon against him. This was the time and the place for the final confrontation she was already planning. To any listener in the room, it was the sentimental, slightly rambling message of a stressed and grieving daughter, a collection of disconnected memories and mundane details. To Dr. Albright, if he ever heard a recording of this, it would be a meticulously constructed cry for help, a reference to their work on military codes, a signal of the antagonist's identity, a warning of a planned massacre, the location, and the exact time. It was a desperate gamble, a message in a bottle thrown into a vast and unforgiving ocean, and its success depended entirely on the memory and brilliance of a man she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. As she finished the call, her hand was slick with sweat. She placed the phone back on the table with a manufactured weariness. slumping her shoulders slightly to complete the picture of a daughter drained by her father's illness. Valerio watched her, his eyes narrowed in suspicion, but the performance had been flawless. The conversation was so perfectly mundane, so filled with the pathetic details of sickness and care, that it seemed to confirm his assessment of her. She was just a girl, burdened by a sentimental attachment that he saw as a profound weakness. He gave a curt, dismissive nod, the tension in his shoulders relaxing almost imperceptibly. He had heard nothing but the babbling of a frightened servant. The danger in his mind had passed. He turned his attention back to the more pressing matter of his rival, Silvio Gallo, completely oblivious to the fact that the seeds of his own destruction had just been planted right under his nose, broadcast from the very center of his seat of power. Elena felt a cold, triumphant wave wash over her, a feeling so potent it almost made her dizzy. She had survived the first test. In the days that followed, Elena's life was transformed into a surreal duality. She was moved from the restaurant into a sterile, high-end apartment in a building Valerio owned, a gilded prison, with panoramic views of this city she was no longer free to walk in. She was under constant guard, shadowed by two of Valerio's men who were polite, but as unyielding as the concrete walls around her. She was no longer a waitress. She had become Valerio's personal oracle, his ghost who could speak. Her new job was to sit in a quiet, minimalist office, a room furnished with nothing but a table, 2 chairs, and a sophisticated audio setup, and translate the communications Valerio's network intercepted. The work was mentally grueling and morally corrosive. She was forced to become a cog in the machine of his criminal enterprise, her linguistic gift twisted into a tool for extortion, intimidation, and conspiracy. Each word she translated felt like a betrayal of the academic ideals she once held, a stain on the beautiful, dying languages she had once sought only to preserve. She played her part with meticulous precision, becoming the perfect, compliant asset. She was quiet, efficient, and never asked questions that strayed beyond the immediate task at hand. She provided Valerio with flawless translations, giving him a crucial edge over his rivals who relied on cruder, less nuanced interpretations. She helped him anticipate moves, understand threats, and identify weaknesses within other criminal organizations. This built a fragile but essential layer of trust. Valerio began to see her not as a person, but as a highly effective, proprietary piece of software, an intelligence asset that belonged exclusively to him. He would sometimes watch her work, a flicker of something akin to pride in his cold eyes, the pride of an owner admiring a valuable acquisition. He never saw the woman behind the skill, the scholar who was cataloging his every move, his every weakness, his every crime, filing them away in the vast, organized archive of her memory. Her true work began when the guards were not looking, in the stolen moments of solitude. Her mission was no longer just about bringing Valerio to justice for the assassination plot against Gallo. It was about finding proof of the crime that mattered most to her, the destruction of her father. She became a hunter, her senses honed by years of academic research, now repurposed for a far more dangerous kind of investigation. She listened not just to the words in the recordings, but to the background noises, the inflections, the names dropped in casual conversation. She started to build a map of Valerio's organization, identifying key players, understanding the flow of money, and learning the brutal history of his rise to power. It was a painstaking process, like assembling a shattered piece of pottery from thousands of tiny, scattered shards. She worked in the silence of her apartment at night, her mind a relentless engine of analysis, turning scraps of overheard information into a coherent narrative of his crimes. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Valerio, in a fit of pique over a subordinate's incompetence, began ranting about the old days, about how he had single-handedly modernized the family's operations. To make his point, he demanded that one of his men bring him the old business ledgers from his father's time, wanting to show the younger generation how primitive their methods had been. The ledgers were brought to the office where Elena was working, 4 thick, leather-bound books filled with handwritten entries, their pages yellowed with age and smelling of dust and ink. Valerio sneered at the meticulous old-world script, using them as a prop in his lecture on his own superiority. He tossed them aside on a shelf when he was done, dismissing them as relics of a bygone era. To him, they were garbage. To Elena, they were a potential treasure map, a direct link to the past she so desperately needed to uncover. For 2 days, the ledgers sat on the shelf, a tantalizing promise just out of reach. She had to wait for the perfect moment, a window of opportunity when the guards were distracted, when Valerio was occupied with a more pressing matter. The chance came when a turf war erupted in another part of the city, pulling Valerio and his top men into a series of urgent, frantic meetings. During a shift change for her guards, she was left alone for less than 10 minutes. It was all the time she needed. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she moved to the shelf, her hands surprisingly steady. She took out her phone, a device that was regularly checked but which they allowed her for the illusion of normalcy, and began to photograph the pages, her fingers flying across the screen. She focused on the years leading up to her father's ruin, searching for any name, any entry, that could connect the elegant script in the book to the brutal reality of what had happened. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she would know it when she saw it. Page after page of names and numbers flashed before her eyes, a dry accounting of a criminal empire's finances. Then she saw it. A series of entries under the heading Urban Renewal Project. It was a euphemism, she instantly understood, for their extortion rackets. And under that heading, a list of small businesses. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the name. Rossi Panificio, her father's bakery. Next to the name were a series of dates and figures, documenting the weekly payments they had bled from him. But it was the final entry that made her blood run cold. It was a single line, dated the week after her father had the stroke. It read, Rossi Panificio, account closed, asset liquidated, and next to it, in the same elegant script, were 2 small, neat initials, M.V. Marco Valerio. He hadn't just ordered the shakedown, he had personally signed off on the final crushing blow. This was it. This was the irrefutable proof, the black and white documentation of the crime that had haunted her for years. It was not just a memory or a story, it was a fact, recorded in the unemotional language of accounting. The abstract monster who had destroyed her family now had a signature. A cold, clear certainty settled over her, displacing the last vestiges of her fear. She was no longer operating on instinct and rage. She was armed with evidence. She finished photographing the relevant pages just as she heard the footsteps of the returning guard in the hallway. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned to her chair, her expression a mask of calm neutrality. The guard entered, gave her a cursory glance, and saw nothing out of the ordinary. He saw the quiet, obedient translator. He did not see the archivist who now held the history of his boss's sins in the palm of her hand. That night, she worked feverishly, piecing together the final elements of her plan. She had the proof of Valerio's past crimes, and she had the means to orchestrate his future downfall. The only missing piece was communication with the outside world, with the ally she hoped she had secured. She needed a confirmation that her message had been received, that forces were moving on her behalf. She remembered Dr. Albright's peculiar habit of posting cryptic linguistic puzzles on a public academic forum, a niche corner of the internet frequented by a handful of scholars. It was a long shot, but it was the only channel she could think of. Using the limited monitored internet access she was allowed, she navigated to the forum. Her heart leaped when she saw a new post from him, uploaded just that morning. It was a puzzle about ancient maritime navigation codes used by Greek sailors. The puzzle itself was complex, but the title of the post was the signal. It read, "The vulture storm is on the horizon. All hawks to their nests." He had received her message. He understood, and the hawks were coming. The confirmation was like a jolt of electricity, sharpening her focus, solidifying her resolve. Help was not just coming, it was being coordinated. She could now proceed with the final, most dangerous phase of her plan. She had to manipulate Valerio into a trap of his own making, a trap he would walk into willingly, even eagerly. She began to subtly alter her translations of the intercepted messages from Silvio Gallo's camp. She started to feed Valerio a carefully crafted narrative, making Gallo seem both more dangerous and more foolish than he actually was. She amplified his threats while simultaneously inserting fabricated details about his plans, details that would make a counter-ambush seem like an easy, irresistible victory for Valerio. She was playing on his deepest character flaw, his arrogance. She knew he would not be able to resist the chance to utterly humiliate his rival in a public, definitive way. She needed a location, a place where both crime families could be contained, a shooting gallery for the trap she was setting. She pored over maps of the city's industrial districts, searching for the perfect spot. She found it in a recently decommissioned naval shipyard, a sprawling complex of massive, empty warehouses and isolated piers on the city's industrial waterfront. It was remote, easily sealed off, and large enough to host the kind of confrontation Valerio's ego would demand. The next step was to plant the idea in his head. During her next translation session, she discovered a piece of intelligence in one of Gallo's messages, a coded reference to a meeting point. She described the shipyard, framing it as Gallo's chosen ground for a final, treacherous negotiation. She presented it as a weakness, a tactical error on Gallo's part, a place where Valerio could easily turn the tables. Valerio took the bait, just as she knew he would. The idea of cornering Gallo in a massive, empty warehouse appealed to his sense of theatrical cruelty. He saw it as a stage for a final, brutal performance, with himself as the director, producer, and star. He began to plan the operation with a chilling enthusiasm, his men scurrying to execute his orders. He was so consumed by the thought of his impending victory over Gallo that his vigilance over Elena began to slip. He saw her now as his most trusted weapon, the architect of his brilliant strategy. He had forgotten that she was a prisoner, a witness, a woman whose life he had destroyed. He believed she was on his side, that her survival was tied to his. He failed to see that she was not building him a throne, she was digging him a grave. The night before the planned confrontation, the air in the city felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Elena sat in her apartment, looking out at the glittering expanse of the city lights, a sea of anonymous souls, each with their own story, their own grief. For years, she had felt like one of those anonymous lights, a small, forgotten flicker in the overwhelming darkness. But now, she was the storm that was coming. She had the ledger entries safely encrypted and sent to a secure server controlled by Dr. Albright's contacts. She had the two most powerful crime bosses in the city moving their forces toward a single, isolated point on the map. She had turned their own paranoia, their own violence, their own language against them. The stage was set. All the actors were in place. The final act of her father's story, and the first act of her new life, was about to begin. The checkmate was just one move away. As she prepared for the next day, a profound sense of calm settled over her. The fear and the rage had been burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unyielding purpose. She thought of her father, not the broken man in the hospital bed, but the strong, joyful man who had dusted her nose with flour in his warm, fragrant bakery. He had taught her a language of ghosts, a key to a lost world, never imagining that it would one day become a key to justice. She was his legacy, not of victimhood, but of resilience. Tomorrow she would walk into a warehouse filled with killers, armed with nothing but her mind and the truth. She would face the man who had shattered her world, and she would make him see her, truly see her, for the first time. She was not the flower to be swept away. She was the fire that was about to consume it all. The following evening, she dressed in the simple, dark clothes Valerio's men had provided for her. They were meant to make her blend in, to keep her invisible during the confrontation. The irony was not lost on her. Her invisibility had always been her greatest shield. and now it was her most effective camouflage. As she was led to the armored car that would take her to the shipyard, she took one last look at the city skyline. It looked different now. It was no longer a symbol of the power that had crushed her, but a silent witness to the justice that was about to unfold. The lieutenants in the car with her were tense, their hands resting on the weapons hidden beneath their expensive suits. They spoke in low, excited whispers about the slaughter they were about to witness, about the final, glorious victory of their boss. They looked at her with a kind of detached respect, the way a soldier might look at a powerful new weapon before a battle. They had no idea the weapon was aimed directly at their own hearts. The drive to the shipyard was a journey through the city's forgotten underbelly, past derelict factories and rusting chain-link fences. The smell of the sea, mixed with the industrial scent of oil and decay, filled the air as they approached the waterfront. The chosen warehouse loomed in the darkness, a vast, skeletal structure silhouetted against the dim glow of the port lights. It was a cathedral of rust and shadows, a perfect, desolate stage for the end of an era. As the car rolled to a stop, Elena could feel the thrum of energy, the coiled tension of dozens of armed men hidden in the darkness, waiting for the signal to unleash hell. She was the one who would give that signal, but it would not be the one they were expecting. She closed her eyes for a moment, a silent prayer on her lips, not for safety, but for strength. The doors were about to open, and she was about to step onto the stage. Inside the car, one of Valerio's men turned to her, a cruel smirk on his face. He told her not to be afraid, that all she had to do was talk, to translate, and Don Valerio would take care of the rest. He patted her on the shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt like a brand. She simply nodded, her face a placid mask. She was not afraid. She was ready. The years of quiet suffering, of swallowed pride, of relentless grinding work had forged her into something harder than any of them could imagine. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a creator of consequences. As the heavy car door swung open, revealing the cavernous, dimly lit interior of the warehouse, she took a deep, steadying breath. The final confrontation was at hand, and she was walking into it not as a pawn but as the queen, ready to topple the entire board. Valerio was already there, standing in the center of the vast concrete floor, a solitary figure illuminated by a single, harsh industrial light hanging from the ceiling. He looked like a king surveying his domain, his posture radiating an absolute, unshakable confidence in the outcome of the night. He saw her approach and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent command for her to take her place at his side. He believed she was his instrument of victory, the secret weapon that would cement his legacy. He was looking right at her, but he did not see her. He saw a reflection of his own power, his own brilliance. This profound, arrogant blindness was the foundation upon which she had built his gallows. And now it was time for him to climb the steps. The trap was set, the evidence was delivered, and the authorities were closing in. All that was left was for her to speak the truth, in a language that everyone, especially Marco Valerio, would finally understand. She walked across the cold concrete, her footsteps the only sound in the immense, silent space. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the nearby sea. She took her position slightly behind Valerio, resuming the posture of a subordinate, a servant. From the far end of the warehouse, a line of headlights cut through the darkness as Silvio Gallo's convoy arrived, their vehicles stopping a respectful distance away. The stage was now fully occupied. The two crime lords, two titans of the city's underworld, were about to face each other, each believing they held the winning hand. They were both wrong. The true power in the room was standing silently in the shadows, a woman armed with nothing but memory and a language of ghosts, ready to orchestrate the symphony of their mutual destruction. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation, a fragile skin of peace before the inevitable explosion of violence. The men from both sides began to emerge from their vehicles, their silhouettes dark and menacing in the dim light. They fanned out, taking tactical positions, their faces grim, their hands never far from their weapons. The atmosphere was electric, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Valerio turned his head slightly. His voice, a low whisper, meant only for her. He told her to be ready, that Gallo would try to lie and posture, but that she was to translate every word, every nuance, so he could savor the moment before he gave the order to annihilate him. He was anticipating a conversation, a final exchange of threats before the bloodshed. He had no idea that the most devastating words spoken that night would not come from his rival, but from the quiet, invisible woman standing at his right hand. The time for whispers and secrets was over. The time for a reckoning had arrived. Elena looked past Valerio, her gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers of two criminal empires. They were men who lived by a code of violence and fear, men who had built their lives on the suffering of others. They were men like the ones who had terrorized her father, who had crushed his spirit with casual cruelty. In their faces, she saw 1,000 tiny reflections of the injustice that had fueled her for so long. There was no pity in her heart, only a cold, hard resolve. She was not here to save them or to condemn them. She was here to balance the scales. Her father's life had been shattered for profit and power, a small, insignificant entry in a dusty ledger. Tonight she would make his story the final entry in theirs, a full and final accounting that would close their books forever. The warehouse held its breath, waiting. The final pieces of her plan clicked into place in her mind with the cold, satisfying precision of a lock's tumblers falling into alignment. She had the proof of Valerio's financial crimes, the evidence that would dismantle his empire from the inside out. She had orchestrated this meeting, creating a perfect containment zone for the FBI to sweep up the leadership of both major crime families in one fell swoop. And she had reserved the final, most important piece of the puzzle for herself. The legal and financial destruction was for the world, but the moral destruction, the personal annihilation of Marco Valerio's soul, that was a debt she intended to collect in person. He had taken her father's voice, his spirit. Tonight she would use her own voice to take everything from him. The stage was not just set for his arrest, it was set for his unmaking. She felt a strange sense of detachment, a clarity that bordered on the serene. The years of grief and anger had been distilled into this single, pure moment of purpose. She was no longer Elena Rossi, the waitress, the scholar, the victim. She was an agent of a justice that was older and more profound than any court of law. She was the living memory of every small business owner Valerio had crushed, every family he had ruined, every life he had casually dismissed as flower to be swept away. Her father had taught her that words had power, that they carried the weight of history and the spirit of a people. Tonight, she would prove him right. She would use the words he had given her to rewrite the end of his story, transforming it from a tragedy of loss into an epic of retribution. The silence in the warehouse was about to be broken, and with it, an empire was about to fall. Silvio Gallo stepped forward, his body a coiled spring of nervous energy beneath an expensive silk suit that seemed too loud for the cavernous silence of the warehouse. He was a man who projected power through noise and gesture, a stark contrast to Valerio's cold reptilian stillness. Gallo's face was florid, his eyes darting between Valerio and the shadows where he knew dozens of armed men were waiting. He stopped 20 feet from his rival, a chasm of cold concrete separating them, and began to speak. The words that came out were in the ancient dialect, a torrent of grievances and veiled threats, the sound of rocks tumbling down a mountainside. He spoke of territories, of respect, of blood that had been spilled. To the untrained ear, it was the opening salvo of a negotiation, a final attempt to find a resolution without violence. But Elena heard something else entirely. She heard the desperate bluff of a man who knew he was walking into a trap, a man trying to posture his way out of a tomb. Valerio turned his head slightly toward her, a silent command to translate, his lips curled in a faint, predatory smile, eager to hear the words of the fly he was about to swat from existence. Elena took a breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs. This was the moment, the fulcrum upon which the entire night and her entire life would turn. She received Gallo's desperate, blustering words, and in the silent, lightning-fast calculus of her mind, she transformed them. She did not translate, she forged a weapon. She kept the raw, aggressive tone of Gallo's speech, but stripped it of its underlying fear, replacing it with a cold, unshakable arrogance that would be a perfect mirror of Valerio's own. She looked at Valerio, her expression one of carefully neutral diligence, and began to speak, her voice clear and steady in the echoing space. She told him that Gallo was not negotiating. She told him Gallo was mocking him, calling him a coward for hiding in a warehouse, for needing so many men to face him. She wove in a fabricated proverb, a vicious insult in the old dialect about a vulture that eats the carrion left behind by true predators. She aimed the words like a stiletto, directly at the fragile, pulsating ego of the man who believed himself to be a king, knowing that a king can forgive a threat, but never a mockery of his power. She felt a cold, exhilarating thrill as she watched the poison of her words begin to work, seeing the flicker of amusement in Valerio's eyes die, replaced by a gathering storm. The change in Valerio was immediate and terrifying. The muscles in his jaw bunched into hard knots, and a dark flush crept up his neck, a visible sign of the volcanic rage building beneath his controlled exterior. His eyes, which had been alight with the thrill of the hunt, narrowed into slits of pure homicidal fury. He had come here to orchestrate a humiliation, and instead he was being made the fool. He took a single, almost imperceptible step forward, his entire body radiating a murderous intent that seemed to lower the temperature in the warehouse by several degrees. He hissed a response back at Elena, a string of brutal, visceral threats that were no longer about business but about a deep, personal violation. He spoke of what he would do to Gallo's family, of the monuments of pain he would build in his name. Elena listened to the vile promises, her face an unreadable mask, and then she turned her attention back to the nervous, posturing figure of Silvio Gallo. She translated Valerio's rage, but once again, she amplified it, twisting it into something even more monstrous. She told Gallo that Valerio accepted his challenge, that he would meet him alone, in the center of the floor, to settle this not with guns, but with knives, like the old days. It was a challenge so archaic, so insane, that it shattered the last vestiges of protocol, a direct appeal to the violent primal honor of the men watching from the shadows. It was in that moment, as the men on both sides tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, that Elena made her final move. The warehouse had become a powder keg, and she had just lit the fuse. But before the explosion could consume them all, she did the one thing no one expected. She stepped forward, out from the protective shadow of Marco Valerio, and into the single, harsh pool of light that illuminated the center of the floor. She was no longer a translator, a conduit for the words of others. She was the focal point, the true center of power in the room. The movement was so unexpected it froze everyone in place, their minds struggling to process this impossible shift in the script. She did not look at Gallo. She did not look at the dozens of armed men. She looked only at Marco Valerio, and for the first time that night, she allowed the entirety of her being, the grief, the rage, the years of silent suffering, to surface in her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was not the quiet, professional tone of a translator. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence, a voice that carried the weight of a history he had long forgotten. She spoke in clear, unaccented English, a language that every single person in that warehouse could understand. "My name," she said, "is Elena Rossi." The name hung in the air, a simple two-word statement that carried the force of a physical blow. Valerio stared at her, his face a canvas of pure, uncomprehending confusion. The name meant nothing to him. It was the name of a waitress, a tool, an asset. It held no significance in his world of power and violence. But Elena was not finished. She took another step closer, closing the distance between them, her gaze unwavering. "My father's name," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word, "was Giuseppe Rossi. He was a baker from a small village near Corleone. A man you destroyed. a man whose life you crushed for a few lines in a ledger, a man you called flower, waiting to be swept away. She flung his own cruel words back at him, each syllable a drop of acid on his soul. And in that instant, a flicker of memory, of recognition, ignited in the depths of Valerio's cold eyes. He remembered. Not the face, not the man, but the phrase, the arrogance of it, the casual cruelty. He remembered the small, insignificant victories that had paved his road to power, and the devastating realization of who was standing before him began to dawn. A slow, horrifying sunrise of truth that shattered his world. The carefully constructed universe of Marco Valerio collapsed in on itself. The woman he had seen as an invisible servant, a piece of furniture, was the ghost of his own forgotten sins, returned to exact a price he never thought he would have to pay. His face, which had been a mask of rage, now crumpled into a grotesque portrait of disbelief and dawning terror. The rival across the floor, the turf war, the entire criminal empire, it all faded into insignificance, replaced by the impossible, accusing eyes of this one woman. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to threaten, but no sound came out. His power, which was rooted in the anonymity of his victims, was useless against a victim who had a name, a face, and a voice. It was at this precise moment of his unmaking, as his soul was laid bare in the center of that grimy warehouse floor, that the world outside erupted. The massive, corrugated steel doors at either end of the building exploded inward with a deafening crash, ripped from their hinges by armored tactical vehicles. Blinding white floodlights flooded the space, turning the shadows to dust and silhouetting the dozens of heavily armed figures pouring in from all sides. The air was filled with the deafening beat of helicopter rotors overhead and the amplified, booming command, "FBI, drop your weapons. You are all under arrest." The warehouse descended into a maelstrom of controlled chaos. The carefully positioned mobsters, who had been seconds away from a bloody firefight, were caught completely off guard, their bravado evaporating in the face of overwhelming, professional force. They were disarmed and forced to the ground with brutal efficiency, their brief reign as kings of the underworld, ending on their knees on a cold, dirty concrete floor. Through it all, Elena stood perfectly still in the center of the storm, an island of calm in the hurricane she had unleashed. She watched as Marco Valerio, the untouchable titan, the vulture who soared above the law, was slammed against a pillar and cuffed, his expensive suit now covered in dust, his face a mask of impotent rage and utter humiliation. As they led him away, his eyes found hers one last time. In them, she saw no remorse, only a burning, bottomless hatred. And something else, something far more satisfying, the pure, agonizing understanding that he had been brought down not by a rival, not by the police, but by the memory of a single, forgotten baker, a piece of flour that had refused to be swept away. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. 6 months later, the city felt different, as if it could finally breathe a little deeper. The Valerio and Gallo crime families, decapitated in a single night, had crumbled, their empires dismantled by a series of federal indictments built on the evidence Elena had provided. The name Elena Rossi was not known to the public. She was a ghost, a classified asset whose story was locked away in the most secure government files. But she was no longer invisible to herself. She stood in a quiet, sunlit room, not a restaurant but a seminar room at Quantico. The crisp black uniform was gone, replaced by a smart, professional blazer. She was addressing a group of new FBI recruits, her voice calm and authoritative, as she lectured on the use of linguistics in intelligence gathering, her father's language now a tool to protect, not to conspire. Her work had given her a new purpose, a way to honor the gift he had given her by using it in the service of a justice he had been denied. Her life was her own again, rebuilt from the ashes of her past, stronger and more brilliant than before. After the lecture, she drove to the St. Jude's Care Facility. Her father was still there, his condition unchanged, his eyes still lost in a distant world. But the room was different. It was brighter, filled with flowers, and the care was the best money could buy, paid for not by the meager wages of a waitress, but by the generous salary of a valued government consultant. She sat by his bed, holding his frail, unresponsive hand, and she told him everything. She told him about the warehouse, about the look in Valerio's eyes, about the fall of an empire. She spoke to him in the old dialect, the sacred language of their shared past. Her words a gentle, loving stream of consciousness. She knew he might not understand, but she also knew, on some deeper level, that the spirit of the strong, proud man who had taught her these words could feel the peace she had finally brought them. She was no longer haunted by injustice. She was defined by her victory over it. Her father's legacy was not one of tragedy, but of a quiet, unyielding strength that had been passed down to his daughter, a strength that had, in the end, been enough to move mountains and topple kings. Her journey was a testament to a simple, profound truth, that no one is truly invisible, and no act of cruelty is ever truly forgotten. The world is not run only by the loud and the powerful, but by the quiet, the observant, the ones who remember. Dignity, she had learned, was not something that could be given or taken away by men like Valerio. It was a fire you kept burning inside yourself, a quiet flame that, when shielded and nurtured, could grow into an inferno capable of burning down the darkest of empires. As she left the facility and walked out into the warm afternoon sun, she felt a sense of closure that was as deep and profound as the ocean. The scales were balanced. The debt was paid. Her father's story had been given its true and final chapter, and her own was just beginning, a future built not on vengeance but on the enduring power of a single, unwavering voice speaking truth in a world of lies. If Elena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.